Hi, thank you. My research has to deal with the net greenhouse gas effect of building metro rail. I'm broadly interested in cities and the role of infrastructure in achieving long-term climate change goals. As has been mentioned a couple of times today, we're now living in an urban century. More than 50% of the world's population lives in cities, and by extension, so do their greenhouse gas emissions. Urban greenhouse gas emissions can be sorted into three groups: workplace, home, and transport. In London, over the past decade, significant progress has been made in reducing greenhouse gas emissions at work and at home. But since about 1990, total transport emissions in London have held steady. This is because most of these emissions are due to car transport, and increases in engine efficiency haven't kept pace with the fact that there are more people in London, and those people are traveling farther more often. One of the key ways to reduce the environmental impact of people's transit behavior is to reduce private car transport and increase public transport. The advantage of public transport is that once the infrastructure is built on a per kilometer basis, it's a lot cleaner. For this reason and others, a lot of people are advocating that we should be expanding our public transit systems so that more people have access. They can leave their cars at home and not own them at all. And there's the added benefit that building new public transport can attract new real estate development, which, given the right circumstances, can be green. For my research specifically, I'm looking at case studies of new metro urban rail transit that's about 10 years old. The reason for this age delay is that I want to look at projects that are both old enough that the city has had time to develop and react to them, and that I can work with measured data rather than projected data, but also young enough that the projects were built with modern technology so that the conclusions from my research will be applicable to ongoing and future projects. So to calculate the net greenhouse gas effect of new urban rail, I'm looking at 4 factors: the construction and the operation, and then on the avoided GHG side, the effects of mode change and urban changes in urban form. For this presentation today, I'm going to be concentrating on the Jubilee Line extension, which is the last major underground extension in London. It came into operation in 1999. It's 17 kilometers long with 11 new stations, most of which were underground, and very conveniently for me is exactly the right age for my research. So when you're talking about the greenhouse gases associated with construction, it's mainly a function to calculate it of tabulating everything that went into the construction, or all of the materials and all of the energy. You then multiply this tabulation by the embodied carbon or embodied greenhouse gas emissions, and embodied carbon factors are publicly available, the most famous of which was published in 2008 by Jones and Hammond. Just to give you an example of how much resources go into the construction of an underground line, these are numbers from Crossrail, which is currently under construction. And to quantify these numbers a little bit for you, it's enough concrete for 203 Olympic pools, entirely full of concrete, and enough caulking to fill 130 million teapots. So moving on from construction, once you have the system, you need to operate it. The embodied greenhouse gases associated with operation are primarily due to the operation energy, but also to the materials used in annual maintenance. Again, it's a matter of tabulating everything that goes into the system and multiplying it by the intensity of those factors. For energy, there are published factors in the UK by DEFRA and DEC. And as you can see, after coming down significantly from 1990 to 1999, the embodied GHGs of electricity in the UK has held steady for the last 14 years. So this brings us to how much carbon and greenhouse gases go into building a metro system. And next I want to talk about how much it saves us. So far, it's been fairly straightforward. You count everything that goes in, you multiply it by the embodied energy factors. On the other side, it's more complicated because we're talking about comparing a situation that exists versus one that doesn't. Oh, sorry, I forgot about this slide. This is just an example of the energy that is used by the London Underground. It's the single biggest electricity user in the UK, with the JLE itself using about 100 gigawatt hours of energy a year. So moving on to mode shift. Any kilometer traveled by rail versus by car, if we just look at the tailpipe emissions, is about half as GHG intensive. And so if you can shift a lot of people from cars onto rail, you can have a great savings. unfortunately for the JLE, the early data show that there was only about a 2% mode shift from public car to transport, and most people were actually moving from other areas of public transport onto the JLE. From a similar study that was done for light rail in the US, they found that they needed a 35% mode shift to even begin to get payback from mode shift over the long term, and that was for something above ground with a lot less invested materials. But there's other ways to look at the effects of mode shift. The early numbers were only from the original switch onto the JLE, and as I've mentioned, since then there's been a lot of time for patterns and behaviors to develop that really wouldn't have taken place without the Jubilee Line extension. The people who live and work there now may have ended up in entirely different parts of the city, which is hard to predict and compare. So what I'm doing is I'm looking at published transportation studies that benchmark early in the existence of the JLE, and also we can look at travel behaviors now, and calculating the increased access to the transportation network that was provided to various parts of the city by the Jubilee Line extension, and comparing that against the mode distribution in that neighborhood. And if our assumptions about transportation access and mode choices bear fruit, I should see meaningful statistical trends in the relationship between accessibility to the JLE and people's mode choices, and thereby I can calculate the avoided kilometers by car and associated greenhouse gas emissions. The last element I'm looking at is urban form, which is probably the hardest one to calculate because, again, we're comparing something that exists versus something we can't have imagined. Transportation infrastructure has a well-established codependent relationship with real estate investment. Once transportation infrastructure is built, there's new access to the land, which makes it more appealing for developers. But at the same time, an area that is highly developed is more appealing for transportation infrastructure because there's more people to use it. Transportation infrastructure has been long believed to act as a center of gravity for concentrating development. Building a new transit line won't attract new development to a city usually, but it can concentrate it in particular neighborhoods. This is good news from a greenhouse gas perspective because people who live in denser neighborhoods use less per capita greenhouse gas emissions than people who don't. So again, to calculate this, I'm using GIS and published data from the UK Census and the DEC residential energy tables. And I'm comparing the changes in jobs, residences, and dwellings to the increased access that was provided to parts of London by the Jubilee Line extension. And then hopefully all of this increased building that was concentrated by the Jubilee Line will have meaningful effects on people's energy use. So far I've just been gathering data and setting out the methodology for my work. The next thing to do is to sit down and crunch the numbers. The workplace data was only released from the 2011 census was only released last week, so I'm very excited to look at that. Also, the bill of quantities for the Jubilee Line has been lost to history, so I have to rebuild it. And I need to confirm the energy use of the Jubilee Line as part of the London Underground. Also, to test this methodology and also provide a robustness to the conclusions I find, I'm looking at a case study in Toronto, Canada, which you may be able to tell from my accent is my hometown. So my conclusions are that the transportation sector needs more attention. It's a huge contributor to urban greenhouse gas emissions, and its contribution is likely to grow. It's also, building new transportation infrastructure is also very resource intensive, but we have the benefit that it has a dependent relationship with real estate development. So we have the power through our transportation infrastructure decisions to influence the urban form of our cities and potentially have a great opportunity for reducing urban greenhouse gas emissions. And I want to know the answer to this question because I think if our investments in urban transportation infrastructure are not paying back, we should know. We should know why, and we should figure out a way to make sure they do in the future.
Hey, there's a question here.
I think it's very interesting. I'm from the US, so we have kind of the same accent. But I was wondering if maybe a next step might also be looking at less resource-intensive infrastructure investments like bus rapid transit to see if having less resource-intensive rail or transportation infrastructure then equals to, greater value for the money that we're spending and also greater GHG reduction. So just a thought.
Yeah, when I first started this project, as I think we all do with our PhD, I had a huge project carved out, and I wanted to look at light rail versus heavy rail versus bus rapid transit. And in the end, I focused on heavy rail for a couple of reasons. One, it's currently undergoing a global renaissance. A lot of cities are expanding or building new heavy rail systems. But also, I read a great quote recently that there's nothing like building rail for marking our dedication to a place and our long-term investment in it. And there's a lot of, especially where I'm from, social reasons that people want rail instead of buses. And so I think that all of these different types of public transit have a role to play. But this is the most resource-intensive one, and also in many ways the most popular one. So it's where I chose to focus for now.
Peter.
Thanks, Hannah. That's very interesting. Are you looking at whole life cycle costs? I'm just thinking that the rolling stock on the underground lasts 30 or 40 years or something, whereas cars presumably last an average of 10 or 12 years or something, and buses probably about the same. So you've got the embedded costs more coming up more often if you replace vehicles on some of the other modes than if you replace them on the rail rolling stock. Did you take that into account?
I'm thinking about it, the exact boundaries of what are going to be included. I'm not doing whole life cycle because I'm not going to do demolition and disposal. I don't know of anyone who's taken apart a metro system. But the rolling stock I would like to include, but it then gets to an issue if I'm comparing rolling stock against car replacement. I should also be comparing infrastructure investment against infrastructure investment. And the problem gets very big very quickly.
One last question up there.
Thanks. I think this is a very important topic, actually, that you're looking at, because we often, when we're appraising transport schemes, we miss the developmental impact that happens 5 or 10 years later. But it's a difficult topic because the location choice of individuals is related more to more things than just accessibility. So how do you handle that in your analysis? Are you looking at accessibility change and then other things like attitude to use particular modes or affordability of house by purchase or other factors like that? Do you have those in your calculation?
I'm getting to some of those. In my first pass, I was hoping the effect of transit would be powerful enough that I didn't have to consider things like land availability or social economic factors. But I was wrong, or that didn't bear fruit. So we're changing the analysis a little bit. One of the ways to control for some of that is I'm looking at a fairly wide area of East London. So if you see on these figures, it's a 2-mile buffer around the JLE, so it's enough, the study area is big enough to capture areas that from standard transportation modeling assumptions shouldn't have been meaningfully affected. And so by looking at those other areas which are close enough that they have similar socioeconomic backgrounds, similar types of community makeups in East London, similar history, I'm hoping to mitigate for some of those factors, but it's definitely a risk. But it's also a difficult thing to talk about because, for instance, on socioeconomic factors, if a region was rich, it can be more appealing, but it also might mean they have more ability to, for NIMBYism to stop development in the area, where if a region was poor, it might be ripe for gentrification, even though it wasn't at once originally an appealing place to live. And so how do you quantitatively balance those?
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation which covers a very complicated subject. I think we wish you well with your PhD.
Thank you.